Alright, I don't really know how to go about this review, but I will do my best. If you are into a tabletop RPG hobby, you are probably aware of the new major release, ACKS 2, or maybe ACKS II, which stands for Adventure Conquer King System Imperial Imprint. I am primarily a GURPS player, and I admit that most other systems do not interest me, and even most of the recent GURPS releases didn't pique my interest. This is less of a problem of low quality, even though there is a visible decline, but the fact that I find GURPS to be a complete system, aside from liking GURPS vehicles. So why did ACKS 2 grab my attention and didn't let it go still? Because it made me feel that there are still people that genuinely care about the hobby, that there are people who go against the modern flow of OSR PDF slop that tells you to rule zero everything, that there are people who have the perseverance and work ethics to streamline and perfect the classical concepts. It is genuinely inspiring and, as people say nowadays, white-pilling. The three core books are the revised Rulebook, Judge's Journal and Monstrous Manual. There is also the upcoming Treasure Tome Kickstarter, and the back archive of ACKS books that for the most part are compatible with ACKS 2. I'll review all three books to give you a more complete picture, because each book has its own appeal and use even outside of ACKS. Actually, I already mentioned and praised some parts of the books in the past, but I was using the work-in-progress documents, so let's take a look at the actual release version. The first book is the revised Rulebook, which is the equivalent of the player's handbook. This is a dense tome of 550 pages, almost as long as GURPS basic set, which says something. The introduction is clear and concise. The only thing that I would like to mention is the damage type icon table. Generally, I do not like icons replacing words, because the Pathfinder 1E bestiary, monster type and habitat icons were illegible to me. These ones seem quite clear, so I will not hold it against the author. The first chapter is titled Characters. If you are familiar with AD&D, you'll find pretty much the same thing here, but streamlined and perfected. I think you'll hear this combination of words a lot from me. Like in AD&D, you roll your stats first, and only then choose a character class. All 6 classic stats are there, but Wisdom was renamed to Will, probably to bury the dead horse that is the what's the difference between intelligence and wisdom question. Instead of each class having unique attribute minima and maxima, now each class has one or more key attributes, meaning that this attribute must not be lower than 9. Streamlining. Another concept that is introduced is activity. Activities are divided into dedicated activities, ancillary activities, and incidental activities. Dedicated activities take 8 hours to perform, ancillary activities take 1 hour to perform, incidental activities require virtually no time at all. For the most part, this is used to streamline the different actions so you know how many activities you can perform per day. It's not very granular, but it does its job well. And due to the relative lack of granularity, it improves the speed of resolution. The second chapter is about the classes. Here we have something that is actually new. Across the D&D editions, there were times when non-human races were classes, when races had class restrictions, and when there were no restrictions at all. ACKS does something in between. Each race has a list of unique classes. Thus, humans have the regular fighter, mage, thief, while elves, for example, have elven nightblade and elven spellsword. Thus, by picking a class, you pick both your class and your race. I find this to be an interesting compromise, even though I prefer the unrestricted classes of D&D 3.0 or 5. The core human classes are Fighter, Explorer, Thief, Mage, Crusader, and Venturer. They are called core classes because each of them showcases a different area of the game in order of complexity: combat, wilderness exploration, dungeon exploration, arcane magic, divine magic, and mercantile ventures. Isn't that a great idea? After that, there are 9 additional classes called campaign classes that use the core classes as a base and alter them in certain ways. The classes are Assassin, Barbarian, Bard, Blade Dancer, Paladin, Priestess, Shaman, Warlock, and Witch. Then there are several demi-human classes. Classes have different numbers of levels, and the experience progressions also are different, just like in AD&D 1E. Thus, this wasn't streamlined, but there's probably a good reason for that. I have never played AD&D or ACKS, but everything written in ACKS seems to have a good reason for its existence. Each class has a short assortment of class powers. For example, a fighter only has 3 class powers. One class power for each class is tied to domain level play. Usually this is the ability to attract followers and henchmen by acquiring a castle or a similar structure. I should know that this is not mandatory. If you want to avoid domain level play, you can continue to delve into dungeons. However, I think that you would be missing out on a lot of enjoyment. Also, what I found interesting is that the number of hit dice grows only up to 9 dice, and each level after that merely gives a static bonus. I assume that this is done to avoid the HP bloat of the more modern D&D editions. Each class also has a list of 8 templates. A template consists of a pre-selected list of proficiencies and an equipment loadout. What's special about it is that the template is determined randomly. If the template you rolled doesn't suit you, you may choose one from a lower roll and not a higher roll. The interesting part is that while there are 8 templates, you do not roll a 1d8, but roll a 3d6. Thus, the templates are on a bell curve, and you are more likely to land somewhere in the middle. For example, for a fighter you are more likely to be an auxiliary or legionary, but you still would be able to be a corsair, ravager, or thug. The higher roll, the better the equipment seems to be, as the higher rolls gives you options to become a gladiator, signifier, or even a cataphract. I actually really like this. I should give a special mention to the Venturer class. While Fighter, Thief, Mage, Crusader, and Explorer are quite self-explanatory and familiar, the Venturer is something that you will not see in any other system. A Venturer is an adventurous merchant, with class powers tied to mercantile ventures, because the rules for them in ACKS are quite extensive and nothing like you have seen anywhere else. The next chapter is titled Proficiencies. If I were to use the modern D&D terms, I would say that proficiencies are something between feats and skills. While the majority of ACKS 2 seems to be inspired by AD&D 1E, the proficiencies are clearly inspired by, well, proficiencies from AD&D 2E. A proficiency typically allows you a certain new action, or gives a bonus to other actions. I can see that the OSR players would see it while reading this chapter. One proficiency deserves special attention: land surveying. I actually do not know what GURPS skill would do what this proficiency does. Perhaps I'll have to add expert skill, land surveying, or something like that. Next up we have equipment. The title is a bit of a misnomer, because aside from actual equipment there are prices for vehicles, structures, lodging, hirelings, etc. This is not a dig at the author. I don't know what title would even work better here. Now here's the best part about ACKS. The first page of the chapter has a costs of living table, and for the most part it correlates with its GURPS counterpart. Since ACKS has a detailed and realistic economic system that I will talk about later, this means that it's easy to convert ACKS gold pieces to GURPS dollars. The conversion rate seems to be 1 GP equals to $100. This simple thing makes many of the ACKS rules GURPS compatible, including the domain management rules that GURPS lacks. I don't really consider GURPS realm management functional. Isn't that amazing? This is the chapter where the concept of market class is introduced, and it's an important one. There are 6 market classes, from class 1 to class 6, where class 1 represents a metropolis bazaar, and class 6 represents a small village market. The table of equipment availability by market class tells you how many items of a certain price range are available for sale in each market class each month, and the same limit applies to the market purchasing items from adventurers. Even though I have read 1E AD&D DMG beforehand, I do not remember anything like that there, but I certainly do remember a similar concept of GP limit by settlement size from D&D 3.0. ACKS expands this concept and ties it to other different subsystems, such as hireling availability and mercantile ventures. The market class concept is one of the things I'm definitely going to borrow for my GURPS games. Apparently the topic of encumbrance is controversial nowadays, even though I do not understand how you can even play without the rules for encumbrance. ACKS measures weight not in pounds, but in stones. Historically, stone varied from 8 to 14 pounds, but ACKS assumes it to be around 10 pounds. This is a semi-abstract combination of mass and bulk. While it is less granular than using pounds, it makes bookkeeping easier. I am okay with this approach. Of course, there are also rules for hirelings, henchmen, mercenaries, and specialists. While they did exist in AD&D, here they are more streamlined and detailed. Rules for loyalty and morale are also there. Another highlight is the rules for spellcasting services that I may have to investigate in more depth and adapt to GURPS. This is a very important moment in my opinion. Rules for construction projects are pretty simple and quite similar to those found in GURPS. Nice! The next chapter is spells. I can't really say much. For the most part, it's all the stuff you see in AD&D, but renamed. As far as I know, this was done to distance the system from the OGL after that entire debacle. A reasonable decision. The next chapter is titled Adventures. This is a big one. First, it talks about dungeon delves. Just like in AD&D, dungeon exploration is done in turns and rounds, where a turn is around 10 minutes and a round is around 1 minute. The concept of dungeon exploration turn is something that should return to more modern systems. It makes tracking time much easier, and time tracking is extremely important. Dungeon turns and rounds also play nicely with different tasks that can be performed methodically or hastily, such as searching for traps or picking locks. There is an entire page about marching order and mapping, something that many players seem to ignore. Personally, I am tired of asking players about their marching order again and again, and being met with silence. And then they get mad, because the order they had in their head was different. Why is it so difficult? But anyway, let's stop whining about my personal problems and continue looking through the book. Rules for light and darkness are clearly defined. To be fair, they always were pretty straightforward in D&D. It's GURPS that for some reason had to obfuscate the rules as much as possible. Now there is only half a page about traps, but it's not without new ideas. You may find discussions about traps in tabletop RPGs online, with many people saying that traps are lame because they are basically HP tags with a skill check. The OSR says that every trap should test the player's skill instead of a character's skill, basically becoming a puzzle or the game of read the GM's mind. In D&D, you just trip a wire, then fall into the pit if you fail a save, take damage, and hear the GM cackle in glee. In GURPS, it's actually exactly the same. In ACKS, there is one tiny change that greatly improves how traps work and makes them so much more fun. I'll quote the book. When an adventurer takes an action that might, but not necessarily will, activate a trap, such as walking down a corridor with a tripwire, the judge will secretly roll 1d6. On a roll of 1 or 2, the adventurer has accidentally activated the trap. On a roll of 3 to 6, the adventurer has accidentally missed the trap entirely, and it remains inactivated. I think the implications of this small rule are huge, First, the vanguard of the party not necessarily is the one who takes the brunt of all the traps. Second, player characters have to keep in mind that they simply might have missed a trap, and that the passageway may not be as safe as it seems. Third, if you are retreating, you or your pursuers may trigger traps even if you are taking a known route. Isn't that great? I am going to borrow this for my GURPS games. The next section deals with the wilderness expeditions. For the most part, it's pretty similar to the wilderness expedition rules from GURPS, but with the addition of better rules for land surveying and searching the wilderness areas. The encounters section is something that I want to adapt to GURPS, because GURPS doesn't actually have proper rules for that, for some weird reason, aside from the ambushes rule from DF16. I believe that these rules are extremely important and that they would fix many complaints, for example about ranged weapons. You may hear GURPS players complain that range values for weapons do not matter, because the GM always starts the encounter within 10 yards or so, but they never seem to question why the GM does that. The answer is because GURPS doesn't have rules for encounter distances. Here, ACKS gives you a set of rules to determine encounter distance based on terrain, elevation, and some random rolls. They take up 2 pages and aren't complicated. I definitely will GURPSify them. The rules for surprise and encounter evasion are something that I will adapt to GURPS, because the surprise rules in GURPS are infamously bad. In short, surprise depends on 2 conditions: foreknowledge and line of sight. There is a surprise matrix that you can check to see the result. The reaction rules are simple, but very much functional. However, I find the rules from GURPS social engineering more appealing. There still may be some things worth looking at, such as the rules for repeated attempts to influence somebody. Then we have the rules for combat, that I am mostly going to skip in this review. In my opinion, it is difficult to top GURPS combat, but it is also difficult to compare 2 combat systems when they have very different timescales. In GURPS, combat uses 1 second rounds, while in ACKS, the rounds are abstract time intervals ranging from 10 seconds to 2 minutes. When rounds are this long, the combat must have lower resolution. That's fine, but I prefer the high-res combat of GURPS. However, there is one mechanic that seems to be unique to ACKS combat: cleaving. Cleaving, and that is getting a free step and an attack after felling a foe, is something of a universal mechanic in ACKS, meant to simulate powerful heroes chopping through weak enemies quickly. Finally, we have a section on earning experience. Experience in ACKS is earned by defeating, not just killing, monsters, and from treasure recovered on adventures. Back in the day, I thought that gold to XP is stupid, but I changed my mind a few months ago, when I was introduced to the BroSR paradigm. It just makes sense to me now. The next chapter is titled Voyages. I do not have much to say here, because my knowledge of how ships work and all other naval stuff is very shallow. I do remember reading the D&D 3.5 Storm Rack and AD&D of Ships and the Sea that tackle this topic more in depth, but most of the details still elude me. I am a landlubber and do not feel comfortable with being on board of a boat. However, I still very much appreciate the visibility, navigation, weather, survival and encounter distance rules for sea voyages. I do love underwater combat, but the rules presented here are very bare bones, surprisingly. I am probably the only person who cares about underwater rules this much. The next chapter is a big one: campaigns. This is the meat of ACKS, something it unashamedly flaunts in front of other systems. Even GURPS has to kneel in respect, and because of that, I'll have to borrow these rules and GURPSify them. This large chapter deals with everything that is not adventuring. I like how it straight up dumps you into a page-long list of possible activities to showcase just how much you can do that isn't related to dungeon delving. As I mentioned before, each class has a way to attract followers by building a stronghold or another similar construction. This chapter tells you what kind of followers you attract and what their gear is. After that, we are given the domain management rules, because adventurers are expected to advance to conquerors and kings. While parts of these rules were present in AD&D, here they are streamlined and perfected. In my opinion, ACKS 2 strikes the perfect balance between abstraction and complexity. There are rules for securing domains, attracting peasants, population growth, domain development, building urban settlements, collecting revenue, paying expenses, population morale, vassal domains, and many more. It may sound like you would need to do a lot of calculations, but in truth, it usually boils down to subtracting expenses from income and multiplying by population. Sure, I'm skipping some parts, but there is nothing a relatively simple spreadsheet wouldn't be able to do, and there are many fan-made domain management spreadsheets floating around. And, most importantly, these rules are compatible with GURPS, which is the best part for me. Next up we have a section on politics and power, where we are given rules for political power accumulation, intrigue, and other going-ons in a senatorial republic. I'm pretty sure I have seen something to this effect in some obscure third-party D&D 3.0 book, but I can't for the life of me remember the source. Maybe I'm hallucinating. But anyway, this section deals with different policies objectives senators might have and how they may influence you and you may influence them. I think this is an excellent way to produce hooks for more traditional adventures to drive the game forward. After all, some people call domain management games lemonade stands, because you sit idly and wait until the GM gives you something interesting to do. In my opinion, this is more of a passive player problem, but these Senate rules also would be helpful in such situations. The next sub-chapter is one of my favorites, hideouts and hijinks. There were some rudimentary rules for this in AD&D 1E, mostly in the form of assassination prices, and I seem to vaguely recall something in Pathfinder 1E. Here the rules are once again expanded, streamlined, and perfected. You can assign, plan, or perpetrate sabotage, arson, assassination, smuggling, spying, stealing, and many other covert activities. I don't think I have anything bad to say about this. This is as perfect as it gets. Now, the next chapter is something that I haven't seen in any D&D editions or D&D derivatives: mercantile ventures. GURPS, however, has got this partially covered by eidetic memory, medieval sea trade, and low-tech transportation. These are pyramid articles from issues 387 and 395 respectively. These are excellent articles, but they can be expanded or adjusted by the ACKS rules. This subchapter deals with mercantile ventures, buying and selling goods in bulk, paying tariffs, tolls and taxes, transporting goods and passengers, assessing supply and demand, and influencing the market. There are three kinds of mercantile ventures: arbitrage trading, passenger and cargo carriage, and passive investment. The rules may seem complex, with lots of moving parts, but after you read them you realize that they're quite streamlined and written in a way to provide you more opportunities for travel and adventures. Even passive investment isn't as passive as it sounds, as random vagaries can provide adventure hooks. This is another excellent part of the rule set. The next subchapter is titled Sanctums and Dungeons. This one talks about sanctums, a stronghold equivalent for arcane spellcasters, where they can research magic, train apprentices, and conduct experiments. Now you may ask, but how are the dungeons related to all this? Because as a character you can construct a dungeon, attract monsters, harvest monster parts, and extract arcane power from the dungeon to use in magical research. I don't think I have seen anything like that in other systems. The magical research can take form of researching spells, creating or identifying magic items, designing and manufacturing constructs, performing crossbreeding or necromantic experiments, or casting ritual spells. Almost everything from the list either already exists in GURPS, or has frameworks written by me long ago. You should also keep in mind that all this research also grants experience. Also, many research projects require special components in the form of monster parts, and I am already incorporating such special components in my GURPS games. Finally, we have the Congregants and Divine Power section. While the previous section was for arcane spellcasters, this one is for the divine ones. You can draw divine power from your congregations and or blood sacrifice. Divine power can be used to consecrate altars, fields, rulers, magic research, or it can be returned to your god to gain XP. Neat. The next 4 chapters are all interconnected. They are armies, maneuvers, battles, and sieges. They present you a pretty damn good mass combat rule set that doesn't just resolve battles, but also deals with recruiting troops, moving them, supplying them, etc. The battle rules are quite abstract, but not as abstract as GURPS Mass Combat. I haven't tried these rules out, so I cannot say how they work in play, but I have heard good things about them. Yet again, I have to say that they are compatible with GURPS. If you'd like a more detailed mass combat rules that use hexes and counters, consider buying Domains at War Battles. While they were written for ACKS, I don't see anything that would preclude their use in ACKS 2. And even the book itself refers to it in a few places. I have a YouTube video where I showcase Domains at War Battles, and I believe that it's the best fantasy mass combat rule set on the market right now. Next, we have a quite short chapter devoted to the setting, the Oran Empire. It seems to be modeled after the lands surrounding the fantasy equivalent of the Mediterranean Sea, but unlike typical fantasy settings, it's set in the classical era and not the medieval one. After that, we have some miscellaneous stuff, like conditions reference, tables of permanent wounds that remind me of Rolemaster, and character, domain and henchman sheets. What can I say? I expect a revised rulebook to be the one I have the least to say about, but this review is already on its 6th page. I am genuinely impressed by the work put into it and the amount of ideas I can borrow for my GURPS games, but we have 2 more books to go. Judge's Journal is the Dungeon Master's Guide equivalent, and I immediately have a minor nitpick. The book is titled Judge's Journal, but the revised rulebook refers to it inconsistently, both as Judge's Journal and Judge's Journal. While I prefer Judge's Journal, I will assume that Judge's Journal is the correct spelling. This book is smaller. It's only 486 pages long, but it is densely packed with useful information. The first chapter is titled Foundations. Even if you are not playing or running ACKS, I highly recommend reading this chapter to both GMs and players, because it explains the art of game mastering very well. In my opinion, if everyone read this, you would see much less online shit-flinging about agency, dice fudging, problem players, etc. I would like to talk about what's written here in more detail, because it goes against a lot of GM advice you may read online or hear on some YouTube tabletop slop channel nowadays. What's in a Name talks about the role of the game master in ACKS and in tabletop RPGs in general. I can imagine that this page would rile up some modern GMs who just want to tell a story. ACKS Judge is called Judge because the main role is similar to that of a referee in a miniature wargame, harking back to the days of Braunstein, Blackmore, and Chainmail. I couldn't agree more, and this is how I approach my GURPS games. It's not your job to make sure people have fun, it's exactly that. To be fair, I am guilty of saying just make sure everyone has fun, and now I realize that I'm wrong. The GM should create an environment in which everyone could have fun, but being a clown is not his job. The agency theory of fun is something that resonates deeply with me. It eloquently explains why dice fudging, more on that later, quantum ogres, GM fiat, rulings not rules, and similar advice you read online is absolutely retarded, for the lack of a better word. If you are not giving players meaningful choices, they have no agency. If your players cannot predict consequences of their actions, but not with a 100% certainty, then they have no agency. If you are not following the rules and bending them at any chance, then your players have no agency. And why did you buy the rulebook in the first place? I am a strong proponent of the agency theory of fun. I have been guilty of some of the bad things I listed in the past, but I have gotten better. Today's rulings are tomorrow's rules is something I constantly advocate for. If as a GM you encounter a grey area that you have to adjudicate on the fly, better use this precedent to write down a consistent rule. If you are not following your precedents, your players do not know what to expect and hence have no agency and no fun. It's very simple and clear, but the OSR crowd has some strong feelings about this. Letting the story emerge also is something I constantly advocate for. Whenever I issue a call for players, I often get questions such as, how long the story arc is going to be? What will the story be about? Will X be in the game? And the answer is, how would I know? I think I only ran what ACKS calls a directed story once, but the game was actually great despite that. For the most part, I try to go with an emergent story that results from the player's actions and consequences. I didn't get a hang of the process immediately, of course, and had plenty of duds, but I have gotten better. Game mastering is a skill that requires practice to get better. The story web approach suggested in ACKS is definitely something I'm using and having success with. Adversarial action not only describes well how an adversary should be played by the GM, but also reveals some reasoning behind different game design decisions that affected how ACKS is supposed to be played. It also suggests learning and understanding the rules before you house rule them away, which is something I can definitely stand by. Many times I have seen a GURPS GM talking about house ruling something in a way that made me understand that he barely has a grasp on the rule set. Handling combat has some good advice for making combat impactful and how important are risk and stakes. This is something that resonates with me. The only D&D 5e game that I played was very frustrating because there was no risk at all. Even if you lose all your HP, the system just refuses to let your character die. However, there is a part that I disagree here. The spectacle must be awesome. The book suggests you to graphically describe hits, misses and all that to make combat more visceral and graphic. In ACKS, this advice stands, but in GURPS, there is no need for that. The 1-second combat resolution writes the spectacle by itself. Abducting the action is something that I have been using for a long time. It's a way to transform random tables and wandering monsters into a living game world. I made tools for that back in the day that I'm still using. Fudging the dice discusses a contentious topic of, fudging the dice. I agree with the book that it detracts from the agency. If you fudge a roll, why did you roll it in the first place? Why did you lie to your players? Why don't you just hand the players the script? However, there are some caveats described in the book that I actually agree with. Give it a read. Balancing player skill versus character skill is another topic that the OSR scene fumes about. This part shines light on all sides of the debate, and it's a must-read text for GMs and players. Most of the rest of this chapter is devoted to general topics such as handling problem players and hosting your game. It also tackles the difficult topic of politicization of gaming in an eloquent manner. Now let's get to another meaty part of the book, adventures. This chapter outlines procedures for adjudicating dungeon delves, wilderness expeditions, sea voyages, and settlement adventures. I haven't seen such clear instructions in any other system, unfortunately. This sort of stuff is an immense help for the GM, not only as a clear sequence of actions required to adjudicate something, but even just as a checklist to make sure he didn't forget anything, because a generic procedure may differ from a specific case. I have already talked about this on my blog and even showcased the GURPS adaptations of the ACKS Wilderness Expedition procedure. The Wilderness Expedition subchapter also has an impressive weather generation table that I'm definitely going to adapt to GURPS, because the weather mechanics in GURPS are different and more granular. The wilderness encounters mechanics in ACKS are sublime. They are more complex than what you usually see in other games, but I think this complexity is worth it. The rate of encounters depends on the time of day, activity of the party, and the type of area, civilized, borderlands, outlands, or unsettled. Encounters are split into civilized, monster, dangerous terrain, valuable terrain, and unique terrain encounters, and their frequency also depends on the degree of settledness and the presence of road. Things aren't as static as they seem, because for example if you roll a 1 on the civilized or borderlands plus road column, you shift to the borderlands or outlands plus road column and roll again. Thus you can always get surprised by something new and may encounter a monster that usually is only present far away from settlements. Why is it there? That's where you use the abduction principle and the story writes itself. I think that's a wonderful approach, and I will have to borrow it. Monsters also belong to one of 4 rarity categories: common, uncommon, rare, and myth, I mean very rare. Terrain encounters are an excellent way to fill out a hex with points of interest that your players may interact with and probably come back to later. Yet again using the abduction principle to weave random results into a cohesive story. There also are some additional rules for poisons, diseases, and places of power. Surprisingly, the disease rules have been greatly simplified from 1E AD&D. Next up we have the campaigns chapter. This one outlines the sequence of play for campaign activities, when you roll for random encounters, when you calculate population growth, etc. This chapter also has several tables for random domain events, domain encounters, mass combat vagaries that may shake things up. In addition, the rules for hiring henchmen are expanded to divide henchman classes into different rarities. Good stuff. The next chapter is titled Treasure. Each monster is assigned a treasure type that defines what kind of treasure it may have: accidental, hoarding, and raiding, and how much. There are 2 treasure tables for the GM to pick from: classic and heroic. Heroic tables differs in that it has many more coins, while keeping the total value the same, and magic items are generated not by type, as a sword, shield, wand, etc., but by rarity, common, uncommon. I can see the merit in both approaches. Also, there are some cool magic item traits table that add some flavor. The next several chapters are all about world building. I remember saying in the past that I consider the AD&D World Builder's Guidebook to be the best world building book, and I began reading the setting design chapter of ACKS 2, expecting to see if it's better or worse, but to my surprise I found that they barely intersect at all. While World Builder's Guidebook tells you how to build a world, place terrain and civilizations, Judge's Journal avoids that almost entirely, focusing on how and why you should build a setting that gets the most out of the system, and how to build a proper sandbox with a so-called story web. I cannot say which book is better, because they complement one another in a synergistic manner. I am impressed. After discussing the setting at large, the book delves into domain and realm creation, because your conqueror and king characters will need some domains to conquer and rule over. What I found surprising is that both the setting and realm design chapters lack random tables. However, what doesn't lack random tables is the settlements chapter. City design is a complicated subject, and it was tackled both in AD&D World Builder's Guide book and the D&D 3.5 Cityscape. ACKS 2 Judge's Journal, in my opinion, does it even better. You would have to check it out yourself to see the details. The dungeon design chapter is very competently written, but doesn't have anything extraordinarily new. The non-player characters chapter talks about designing NPCs, discussing the difficult topic of demographics of leveled NPCs. This chapter also has many random tables for anything you can imagine being relevant to NPCs. Certainly a useful one. The next 2 chapters are quite special indeed: Abstract Dungeons and Abstract Wilderness. You may have a knee-jerk reaction and say that this is unnecessary, but I think that it's actually brilliant. This is a way to resolve a dungeon delve or wilderness expedition in a few die rolls. In a conventional game, it can be used to, for example, fast forward through the weaker dungeon levels when returning to a mega dungeon, or through a bunch of random encounters on your way there. In a proper ACKS 2 game, this can be useful when sending henchmen to clear out dungeons. However, I think there's extra potential for these mechanics in the BroSR games. One of the most difficult concepts in BroSR games, in my opinion, is that you have to finish a dungeon delve in a single session and return to your safe place. These abstraction mechanics can be used when the party gets stuck in a dungeon or wilderness, but there is no way to return home before the session ends. Thus, you play what you can in person and the rest is abstracted. Isn't that great? I would like to adapt these rules for GURPS, because I think that they are great and novel. But where are the abstract voyages? Next up, we have several chapters for customization, how one can create new classes, races, spells and magic types. The custom rules chapter also has a bunch of optional and variant rules, if you are not satisfied with the default ones. The best part is hidden in the advanced character subchapter, where the author talks about multi-tier play, patron play and one-to-one timekeeping. That is all the rage nowadays. I believe ACKS is perfect for this type of play. I will skip over the adventure scenarios and cosmology and say that the economics chapter is pretty cool. ACKS is praised for its economics system, and it's nice to see the entire thought process laid out in front of you. ACKS uses historical wheat price as a benchmark, and as far as I know, so does GURPS, which is why the costs are so easily convertible between the systems. Anyway, that's it for Judge's Journal. This is an excellent volume for any GM, regardless of the system. Personally, I found lots of useful stuff, even though I'm running GURPS and not ACKS. However, we have one more book left. Monstrous Manual is another hefty tome of 438 pages, but this is not just a list of monster stat blocks. It's something much greater. I'm actually not going to discuss every monster. First of all, you may see many familiar monsters under new names, and as far as I know, this was done to distance the system from OGL, just like what was done with spells. That's a reasonable decision. Most of the classic monsters are here, and even some of the probably obscure ones for the modern audience. For example, the Hobgoblin, a combination of a hobgoblin, troll and a ghoul. That may seem like an original creation, but this is a D&D Thule in disguise, a monster with a very peculiar meta origin. But anyway, the main cool thing about the Monstrous Manual is the stat block format. What I love about ACKS Monster Manual is that monsters are much more than just something for the characters to fight. Each monster has a block of secondary characteristics that I find interesting. The characteristics are expedition speed, supply cost, training period, training modifier, battle rating, lifespan, reproduction, untrained value and trained value. While the primary characteristics come into play in personal combat, the secondary characteristics come into play in mass combat and domain management, tying into mechanics for breeding and training monsters. Each monster also has a list of special spoils that can be harvested from it, be it pelt, poison, antlers or special components that can be used to enchant certain magic items. I recall reading an interview of the author where he said that doing these characteristics was the most tedious part of the process, and I would like to say that the effort is appreciated and respected. My own GURPS Monstrous Compendium project was largely inspired by the ACKS 2 Monstrous Manual, because I saw what a good monster stat block looks like. In my opinion, this book should be the golden standard for RPG monster books. After the long list of monsters, there are additional monster rows. My favorite is the monster parts, pun unintended. The book describes in detail how monster parts are harvested, what they are worth, how much they weigh, what proficiencies they require and how long the process takes. This applies both to mundane parts such as claws, horns, pelts and or meat, and special parts that are used in research and enchanting. While some of equivalent rules exist in GURPS, not all of them do, and the missing ones are relatively easy to adapt. I absolutely love it. In conclusion, what can I say? I think I have said before that if I hadn't found GURPS back in the day, I would have switched to ACKS too, because it seems to take the classic D&D concept and refine it until it's perfect. I still stand by my words. Even though I'm not running or playing ACKS, I find these books immensely useful. In addition, reading it is inspiring. You can see the passion of the author and his competence. I cannot even imagine how difficult of a task writing these books was, but I'm sure that the author feels satisfied. Anyway, tirades aside, I cannot see how anyone could rate this book as anything lower than 10 out of 10. Oh, by the way, the art is nice too. So, thank you for watching. I will see you next time. At least I hope so.